This story is meant to be an audio experience. Feel free to listen while you work or study. All narration and voice acting were performed by the author, that's me, and there will be links to all music used in the description down below. Enjoy! The Lycan Chronicle, Vol.1, The Haunted Boy. Written and narrated by Orlando Lyons.
I don't know, boss. This doesn't feel right. We were hiding in the shadows of the trees, on the edge of a worn dirt path to a nearby town. The town was as dirt poor as we were. Usually, boss wouldn't even bother setting up on a route like this, much less in broad daylight. The word on the street was that the king himself was coming to this glorified hamlet. Now, we weren't stupid enough to try taking on the royal guard, but a shrewd merchant or two would be eager to get ahead of the bustle and sell to all the visitors that would flock here in droves upon the king's arrival. Easy pickings. But this was different.
Ugh, not this again. Just look at the size of that load, brother. This could be the easiest score we'll have for weeks.
We'd spotted a kid who looked no older than my niece of 12 years. They walked slowly, as if each step pained them. They were shrouded in a hooded cloak made from tanned boar hide, and had a bulging sack strapped to their back that was easily bigger than their body. The blade of a short sword caught the sunlight from under the cloak as it hung at their side. Boss let out a sigh.
If you can't stomach it, then stay out of the way. But don't even think about asking for a cut.
My stomach lurched as I recalled the many times I'd had to watch the others eat what they had bought with the spoils I'd been denied. It was a child. As rare as it was to see one alone on the road, the ones we did find would always wet themselves and surrender their goods the instant we drew our weapons. "No, it's okay," I stammered. "I can do this."
"Atta boy,"
Boss said through a smile as he clapped me on the back. Then, with a silent nod to the rest of the crew, he withdrew from the shade and onto the path.
"Oh there, kid. What's the matter? You look a little lost."
Boss made a show of reaching behind his back and pulling out his weapon. It was a crude wooden club, embedded with shards of metal, glass, and whatever else he'd found lying around. Not practical, but it was all about intimidation. The look of fear that sprung onto people's faces when they imagined the sharp and pointy bits being battered into their soft skin. The look that, judging by Boss's confused expression, this kid wasn't wearing at all. On the contrary, they kept walking towards Boss as if both he and his weapon were invisible. Boss grimaced and gave the signal. We melted out of the trees, surrounding the kid and brandishing our own homemade weapons. Again, intimidation. The kid finally stopped. A boy. His body and much of his face were obscured by his cloak, but I imagined that the poor kid's pants were soaked through by now.
"Now," Boss sneered, "what do you say we take a look at what's in that bag?"
When the boy finally spoke, it was in a hoarse and slow voice, like it had been weeks since he'd last spoken. It was not shaking with fear, but rather steady and tired, as if he were a man of 40 years simply asking the bartender about his selection of ale.
"I have nothing of value to you. Let me pass."
The shock on Boss's face registered only for a second, before it was replaced with a wicked grin.
Oh, really? Well, I think you should let me see anyway. After all, it isn't safe for a boy your age to be wandering the roads alone.
Boss began to walk slowly towards the boy, club swaying in his hand.
You might encounter some no-good folks out here, the kind who would bash your head in without a second thought for the chance at something worth stealing.
I expected the boy to at least backpedal, put some distance between him and that club. He didn't move an inch. When he spoke again, it was as if he were the one talking to a child.
I'm delivering food to the town up ahead, and I have none to spare. Let me pass.
So that was it. It had been rumored that the town was going through a food shortage, part of some big crisis, apparently something worthy of a visit from the king. How long had this boy traveled, carrying all that food on his own? Boss, this is a waste of time. Let's leave the kid be, I said cautiously. The man had a deceptively quick temper. Sure enough, his response was a fist exploding across my face and sending me to the ground. When the laughter of my crew began to echo around me, I spat, then stared at the ground as a bloody tooth stared back. Great.
One more word out of you, Boss growled, and you'll be going to sleep with an empty stomach. Again.
From this angle, I could barely see the boy's face. He looked even younger than I'd guessed. His head was turned to the bloody tooth beside me. His nose twitched. Then his stomach growled, long and low, like the croak of a dying toad. Boss's smile returned as he turned back towards the boy.
Well, well, hear that, gentlemen? Sounds like this lad is rather hungry. You know what that means?
Ronald, our muscle, spoke up. Nah, boss. What does that mean?
Boss slapped a palm to his face, as if the answer should have been obvious. Alrighty, let's see if we can use our brains for just a moment.
Boss gestured to the boy while turning to look at all of us.
If I were a young boy, all alone, carrying a crap load of food, and I was that unbearably hungry, wouldn't it make sense for me to reach into that big ol' sack and take out even a small morsel? After all, no one would know, and the food won't get where it's going if I starve to death.
Heads nodded and mouths murmured in agreement. The boy shifted in place, now hunched over from whatever pain he was in. This time, finally, his voice wavered as he spoke.
You all need to leave. Now.
Boss pointed his club at the boy.
See? He can't eat whatever is in that sack. Can any of you geniuses hazard a guess as to why?
Archer, raised his hand.
Go ahead, try to guess.
Boss nodded at Archer, whose head seemed to be smoking from the effort of thinking so hard.
He can't eat it 'cause it ain't food? And bingo was his name-o!
Boss pumped a fist into the air. All the others began to cheer, probably clueless as to why.
So, kid.
Boss once again hefted his club and began to walk towards the boy.
Now that we know you're a liar, are you going to break open that sack for us? Or are we going to need to break open your skull? The boy's stomach gurgled. He slumped. He freed himself from the sack, letting it plop onto the ground. Then he removed his cloak, revealing an impossibly thin frame with a head of messy hair, wearing nothing but a loincloth and the belt from which his sword hung. "It's too late," the boy said, his defeat seeping through his voice. Then he lifted his head and stared directly at Boss. "There's no use fighting this anymore. Not when I'm so close. I'm sorry that your lives had to end this way." I was only half listening. With the boy's cloak removed, under all that greasy and dirty hair, I finally got a good look at his eyes. My Gramps was a veteran of the Imperial War. Whenever we'd go to the altar to confess our sins, he'd always make me cover my ears when it was his turn. As I pretended to obey, I'd listen to him confess all the people he killed. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, elderly, children. Each person's name and age seemed to be embedded in his mind. Whenever I was around him, I tried to avoid looking at his eyes. They were hollow and dim, like there was no soul behind them. They'd always stare into the distance, as if meeting the gazes and memories of people who weren't there. His eyes were the same as the ones I was staring at now, on the face of a boy not even old enough to enter the military. Something was very, very wrong. The smile vanished from Boss's face. His eyes were narrowed, and that one vein in his head began to bulge. "Pardon my hearing, lad," he said through gritted teeth, "but did you just try to threaten me? Because that won't do at all." The crew began to close their circle around the boy, snickering and licking their lips, brandishing their weapons. Boss held his club at the ready as he strode towards his prey. "It's a shame, you know. Had you simply given up that bag, I would have let you off the hook. But you just had to go and disrespect me in front of my crew." Boss stopped walking and spread his arms as he shouted, "Come on, men! Let's teach this little brat some respect for his elders." He then sprinted for the boy, as did the rest of the crew, cackling and shouting. Then they all stopped. From my spot on the ground, I watched their eyes become saucers, watched their faces go pale. I heard Boss's shoddy weapon hit the dirt with a thud. My heart stopped in my chest. Boss's feet were dangling in the air as he was being held up by the boy's arm. An arm that was now covered in gnarled fur and almost twice the size of the rest of his body. The nails on the kid's fingers had become claws, each one thick like a bear's, but long and sharp like a falcon's talon. Boss's face was twisted into a silent scream of agony. One of the claws had pierced his chest and was now pouring blood down onto the dirt. The boy's nose twitched. His stomach grumbled. He sighed. "It's a shame, you know. Had you simply let me pass, I would have let you all off the hook."
The boy's face was somber as he stared at Boss with those haunted, empty eyes. But you just had to go and remind me of how unbearably hungry I am. My mouth went dry as the boy's shadow leapt up from the ground and enveloped him. The boy's body, covered in darkness, writhed and bloated. Then the darkness rose like a black steam, revealing more fur where skin should have been. One arm became huge and shaggy, matching the other. His skinny frame became toned with bulging muscle. His ears had become pointed, his nose a snout, his mouth a gaping maw, lined with too many rows of wicked fangs. By the time the darkness had faded, the boy was long gone. In his place, a monster from the realm of nightmares, a terror that knew no mercy, no innocence. Light! Boss's words died with him as his head was shoved into that gaping maw and then torn from his body. It was as if my bones had been turned to pig iron and my muscles to paste. The others around me were also frozen in place. We dared not move and could only watch as the beast chewed on our leader's skull, then devoured the rest of him in seconds. We'd all heard the stories, the rumors, the howling in the night that we prayed was just a pack of normal wolves. But not once did any of us think that we'd been done in by a living, breathing Lycan! The shouter, Ronald, was the first one to move and the next one to die. He had been next to Boss and had only managed to take a step before the Lycan's jaws snapped down over his chest and ripped it from his torso. The beast chewed and crunched and gulped down every last bit of the hulk of the man. Something flew past the corner of my vision and bounced off the monster's thick hide before clattering uselessly to the ground. An arrow. I turned my head to see Archer, who stood at the opposite end of our circle, pull out another arrow from his quiver. I blinked, and the Lycan's claws had impaled Archer's abdomen. As shocking as it was to see a creature so big move so impossibly fast, I didn't have time to process any of that. I was too busy watching the monster as it clutched the screaming Archer's chest with its free hand, then ripped him in two. It raised the upper half of my mate's body above his head and squeezed, emptying his innards into its eager mouth. Then it licked its lips, reared its head back, and released an ear-splitting roar. The sound seemed to vibrate inside of my bones, threatening to shake me into pieces. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I felt myself curl up like a newborn, hands pressed against my ears as if I were trying to crush my own skull. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't block them out. The screams of terror, the cries of agony, the tearing of flesh from sinew, the crunching of bones being broken and chewed into dust. No one had time to fight, time to run, to even beg for their lives. Horror shackled me in place. I could only sit there, eyes squeezed shut, and listened to the sound of my crewmates being devoured, one by one. I braced myself and waited for my turn, for the shock of a searing tooth or claw piercing my skin and bones, for the mind-bending agony of my body being torn apart, for the sweet release of death as my soul would abandon its mangled corpse. I waited for it, but it never came. In fact, after a few minutes that had felt like hours, I could no longer hear the sounds of slaughter. I could only hear the rush of too much blood flowing through my veins, pumped by a heart that was beating far too fast. That, and the sound of digging. I very, very slowly pried one eyelid open. The beast was now carrying a large clump of dirt in those massive hands, moving it over to a patch of blood-stained path, the only remaining evidence that my crew had ever existed. It dumped the load onto the path, then went back for another, and another. Finally, it patted the loam down onto the blood and sniffed the air, before its chest sank in what I could only vaguely interpret as a sigh. Then it turned its gaze down towards me. I was running before I'd even realized I'd gotten up. I'd managed a few steps before a wall of earth and white-hot pain slammed into my face. I tried to scream, but my mouth was full of dirt. Tried to move, but an impossible weight was pinning my back to the ground. The monster had saved me for last. My eyes wet with tears, lungs pressed into my ribs, nose probably broken. All I could do was say a silent goodbye to those I was about to leave behind. My mother, my darling niece, the beautiful waitress at that one tavern, who I'd never summoned the courage to talk to. Then the weight on my back shifted. The monstrous hand was still pinning me down, but when I slid my face out of the dirt, I saw that it was once again connected to the body of a harmless-looking boy. He stared down at me with those empty eyes. While he no longer looked quite so tired, and his body no longer looked gaunt, now sporting a surprising amount of muscle, his face was now displaying the slightest bit of emotion. Not much emotion, but just enough to vaguely resemble guilt. I coughed as I tried to find both the breath and the words to speak. You aren't going to... The boy shook his head. I'm not hungry anymore. I almost breathed a sigh of relief. Then the boy's still very large Lycan hand tightened around my chest. But there is one problem. The boy crouched down and pointed in the direction of the town with his normal hand. I have stuff to do in that place, so it'd be really annoying if you went there and snitched on me. So... He then pointed in the opposite direction. You are going to go that way. You aren't going to stop until you reach the town you came from. Try to follow me, and you'll be dead before you hit the border. Send any guards after me, and I'll hunt you down, no matter where you try to run. Got it? I hesitated, which was met by a not-so-gentle squeeze of his Lycan hand. I gasped and nodded in the dirt before he could break my ribs. Satisfied, the kid stood. Shadows blossomed from the arm that pinned me before melting away to reveal the arm of an otherwise average boy. I coughed and panted as air rushed finally back into my lungs. I was alive. I wasn't going to die. He wasn't going to kill me. I got to my knees, not yet trusting my legs to hold me upright, and watched as the kid retrieved his cloak and put it on. He reached for the strap of the bulging bag, then paused. He then dug into one of the folds, pulled out a loosely wrapped parcel, and tossed it at me. I recoiled, terrified that the package contained some horrid potion or cursed trinket. But when it landed harmlessly in front of me, and when the boy raised an eyebrow, I decided to take my chances and open it. It was bread and a tied bundle of salted meat. The kid fit his arms into the straps and hoisted the sack onto his back once more.
Save it for when you regain your appetite.
I heard his steps as I stared at the bundle in my hands. Then I heard him stop.
Oh, and one more thing. You should stop being a bandit.
When I looked up, he had already passed me. All I could see was that massive sack of food, connected to the ground by a pair of legs. What? He turned, staring soberly at me with one haunted eye.
You don't seem to have the heart for robbing people. If I were you, I'd consider a career change.
With that, the haunted boy turned back to the path. His cargo sagged against him as he resumed his journey, having slaughtered a gang of full-grown men, and left me alive to tell the tale.
Thank you for listening to The Lycan Chronicle, Vol.1, The Haunted Boy, written and narrated by Orlando Lyons. If you had as much fun listening to it as I did writing it, make sure to leave a comment down below to tell me what you thought. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned for more stories. Until next time.